Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages, and, tonight, we're starting in the heart of it all. Not the battlefield, not the throne room, but the kitchen. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. It's easy to overlook the kitchen in medieval history. We talk so much about kings and knights and the clashing of swords that we forget. Someone had to boil the cabbage, stoke the fire, and keep the trenchers coming. And believe it or not, that job was ... complicated. Imagine a palace in the late 1300s. Let's say the court of Edward III. This was a king known for his taste for grandeur, grand feasts, royal processions, a household that could number in the hundreds, sometimes more. Feeding these people was no small affair. It took a team, often dozens of cooks, bakers, butchers, spitboys, scullions, and kitchen clerks, working in staggering coordination. At the lowest rung of this operation was the turnspit. You might think of this job as trivial. You'd be wrong. A turnspit was the one who roasted meat over an open fire, turning it slowly and evenly so that the outside crisped and the inside cooked through. Simple, hardly. In a royal kitchen, you might have 2, 3, even 4 large animals roasting at once. These weren't your Sunday chicken dinners. These were entire pigs, whole sides of beef, or even swans. Yes, swans. And the turnspit had to stay alert all day, in thick, eye-watering smoke, in clothes that soaked in grease, ash, and sweat. He might be a boy of 10, or an old man, too frail for fieldwork. His back hunched from the heat, his arms sore from cranking the heavy iron bar, and his legs cramped from standing too long without moving. In some larger kitchens, they used turnspit dogs, specially bred to run in a wheel, like a hamster, to turn the spit automatically. But in many cases, especially in colder months or smaller royal manors, it was just a person, a human wheel, turning and turning and turning. The work began before sunrise. By the time the noblemen stirred in their feather beds, the kitchen was already alive. Fires had to be lit with damp wood, cauldrons dragged from storage, knives sharpened, tables scrubbed, herbs gathered from the garden. The first job was bread doorways bread, coarse, dense, loaves, baked in massive ovens that radiated heat like a forge. Next came porridge and boiled meats. Those went to the lower members of the household, the guards, stable hands, messengers. Then came the real labor, the feast preparations, roasting, boiling, baking, seething, frying, poaching, steeping, broiling, and brewing. There were names for everything, no shortcuts, and the chief cook kept records. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, kitchens kept logs. If 3 capons went missing, someone would be beaten. If the beef was overcooked, a whole evening's feast could be ruined. This wasn't just dinner. It was politics, display, reputation. There were entire manuals written on how to serve food in the right order, how many dishes to offer per course, what sauces to use with which meats. And when you served roasted peacock, which, yes, was a real thing, you had to place the skin back on the cooked meat with the feathers arranged to show off its brilliance. Imagine spending your morning cooking a peacock only to spend your afternoon dressing it like a taxidermist. The kitchens themselves were labyrinths. You had the great kitchen, where the main cooking happened, then the pastry kitchen where pies and tarts were made, both savory and sweet. There was a scullery for washing up, a spicery for keeping dried herbs and pepper, which were precious and heavily guarded. The larder stored meat, the buttery kept drinks, and the pantry confusingly, for canned goods, but for bread. Each area had its own master, and each master had underlings. It was a small army, and it all functioned under the watchful eye of the clerk of the kitchen, who kept inventory and ensured rules were followed. For the average cookers, especially the young turnspit, this world was punishing. You weren't respected, you weren't well fed. Often you didn't even get to eat what you cooked. Scraps, if you were lucky, gruel more often, and sometimes nothing at all if the steward was in a bad mood. But still, this was survival because the outside world was harder. If you didn't work in the palace, you worked the fields, or starved, or begged, or worse. At least in the kitchen, you were warm, and you learned. Some young cooks, if they were clever and fast, might climb the ranks, learn how to make sauces, pick up Latin from the scribes, catch a nobleman's attention with a well-prepared dish. But those were rare cases. More often, you stayed in the soot. You aged fast. Your back bent early. And when you couldn't turn the spit anymore, you were let go, or quietly moved to scullery duty, where you spent your final years scrubbing trenches in cold water until your hands cracked. And still, the kitchen kept going, feast after feast, year after year, monarch after monarch, each generation burning through hundreds of workers like kindling, each course a tiny performance of power and plenty, held together by aching arms and scalded hands. And through it all there was the smell, thick and layered. Wood smoke, grease, awful ale, stale bread, and something sweet like cloves or cinnamon, just sharp enough to sting your nose. It stuck to your hair, your clothes, your sleep. And in some way, maybe it even stuck to your memory, long after you were gone. So much of the Middle Ages was built on this kind of labor. Unseen, unequal, unrecorded, but essential, and maybe that's the strange thing, how a civilization could be shaped by the people who stirred the pot, stoked the fire, and never got a statue. But what happened when the feast went wrong? What if the food arrived cold? What if the meat spoiled? Or worse, what if someone tried to poison the king? Well, that's where things get even more interesting. When you picture a medieval feast, it's easy to imagine the long trestle tables, the flickering torchlight, the golden platters stacked with roasted meat and spiced wine. But behind all that pageantry lay a fragile system, one that could easily fall apart with a single bad shipment of fish, ... or a single nervous mistake from a trembling apprentice. The medieval kitchen wasn't just about food, it was about control. Feeding the nobility was as much a show of wealth and influence as it was about nourishment. A cold pie, a delayed course, or meat that had turned could reflect poorly on the lord of the manor. And for the cooks responsible, it could mean punishment, reassignment, or in rare cases, accusation of treason. Let's step back for a moment and consider just how delicate things really were. Medieval food preservation was unreliable. In colder months, meat could be salted, smoked, or dried. In warmer ones, cooks relied heavily on spices to mask the taste of meat that was already on the edge. Imagine hauling a side of beef in a wooden cart for 3 days from a distant estate, through mud and flies and uneven roads, only to find it slightly off by the time it reached the palace kitchen. You couldn't throw it out. That was wasteful, and waste was costly, so you chopped it. You stewed it. You poured wine and vinegar over it. You added cloves, pepper, saffron, if you could afford it. The idea was not to preserve freshness, but to disguise rot. It was, in many ways, a gamble. And the people gambling with it were the cooks like the young spit boy we imagined in Section 1. He might have spent the morning slow-turning mutton over a fire, only to discover the fat pooling on the tray smelled slightly. Wrong. But would he say anything? Probably not, because the kitchen was a chain of command. Speaking up could mean being accused of laziness or sabotage. And if the meat made it to the Lord's table and caused offense or illness, the spit boy might be whipped, or worse, accused of intentional poisoning. Poisoning. That's where things became dangerous. The medieval world was paranoid, and with good reason. Kings died suddenly. Nobles fell ill at the wrong time. A well-timed stomachache could shift alliances. So while most meals were just poorly stored and over-seasoned, the fear of poison haunted every noble table, which meant the kitchen was not just a place of labor, was a place of suspicion. High-ranking officials, like the taster, were employed specifically to test food before it reached the king's plate. This wasn't a glamorous job. Imagine being paid to eat possibly deadly stew, every day. They watched who entered the larders, who handled the sauces, who lit the fires. The kitchen clerk documented it, all who touched what and when. The older royal kitchens even had separate entries for certain meats and for high-value ingredients, guarded and locked. But still, things slipped through. In 1324, for example, a plot was uncovered in which a noble's cook was bribed to lace a pie with deadly nightshade. The cook refused and reported it. He was rewarded, but not promoted, just quietly allowed to keep his job, his silence, and his life. Even when poison wasn't real, the fear of it caused problems. A spoiled egg or sour wine could be enough to spark rumors. And when that happened, the kitchen workers became scapegoats. And what did they have for protection? Very little. Most kitchen staff were unfree labor serfs or servants. They couldn't read, had no legal representation, and few even knew the full recipes they were preparing. Those were usually passed down orally and held tightly by the master cooks, who protected their knowledge like a tradesman guards his tools. And she asked herself, not for the first time, how many others are out there, unseen, unfed? But she wasn't the mistress of the manor. She couldn't order more grain, couldn't open the sealed storerooms, couldn't argue with the steward, who reminded her daily, we must make it last, even when it was barely lasting at all. Sometimes she dreamt of walking away, leaving the kitchen behind, joining the stream of people who, each year, left their manors in secret seeking work in towns, or refuge in monasteries, or just freedom from grain tallies and punishments. But she stayed, because despite everything, the cold, the fear, the sorrow, there was still something sacred in the act of cooking. Something steady. She boiled the oats, stirred the pot, counted the bowls. She did her duty. The old rhythms helped her forget the gnawing in her belly, or the ache in her hands. And as the days grew longer, and the frost began to break, and the first green shoots of spring pushed up through the thawed fields, she allowed herself to hope just a little, that this time the planting would take, that the barley would rise, that the hens would lay, that the pot, long scraped and scrubbed and stretched, would fill again. But spring brought more than warmth. It brought the tallies. The steward would soon count every sack, every grain, every wasted portion. And if the cook had not made the winter, stores last us expected there would be consequences, not for the lord, not for the steward, for her And so she stood by the pot one morning, staring into the quiet broth, and asked herself, had she done enough to survive the winter? Or would she'll now pay the price for feeding too many, too well? The thaw came slowly, not all at once, not in any rush, but in a creeping trickle of mud and melt that dampened boots and swelled the river that curved behind the manor walls. A kind of slow surrender from winter. And yet, as buds nudged out of the branch tips and the air lost its biting edge, the cook knew her peace was fragile. Spring meant counting, and counting meant reckoning. Each spring, the steward made his rounds through the manor's grain stores, smokehouses, and root cellars, quill in hand, frowning over parchments, noting what was left, and more importantly, what wasn't. The tally wasn't merely for record keeping, it was a way of assigning blame. If the supplies ran out before the harvest came in, someone had to be held responsible, and in this manner, that someone was often the cook. She'd survived the winter. More or less, the children hadn't starved. The weak had weakened, but not many had died. But that didn't mean she was safe. Not when there were less than 2 sacks of oats remaining. Not when the saltfish was entirely gone, and the salted pork had spoiled in its barrel mid-February. Not when she'd given extra bowls to the smith's daughter when she fell ill, and allowed the priest's boy to take crusts back to his blind grandmother. None of that would matter to the steward, and certainly not to the Lord. The steward arrived in her kitchen 3 days after the feast of St. Cuthbert, trailed by a scribe and 2 pale boys carrying empty baskets and long wooden rods used for measuring. He sniffed. That was always the first sign. He never spoke upon entering. He just sniffed, as if gauging waste from scent alone. The scribe rolled out the tally scroll. Inked columns, previous year's stores, projected rations, actual remains. She stood still by the central table, her apron clean, her hair bound. A bowl of weak onion pottage simmered behind her, scenting the air with a kind of soft resignation. The steward's voice was calm, but edged. "You've burned through more barley than last year." She didn't reply. "You ran out of ale in January." She inclined her head slightly. "And you fed the ploughboys double rations after Candlemas." "Yes," she said. They were collapsing in the field. His eyes narrowed. "And whose job is it to prevent collapse through prudent winter planning?" She didn't answer that, because she had planned. Meticulously, carefully, every week she'd updated her own tallies. Shifting beans for oats, watering down stews, stretching flour by grinding acorns. But no one had counted on the storms that drowned half the autumn barley. No one could have predicted that 3 sacks of rye would be ruined by mold in the east granary. Still, it was her pot, and anything cooked in it too little or too much was her burden. There were punishments, formal and informal, a fine, perhaps, a cut in her already meager wages, maybe a flogging if the Lord wanted to set an example, or worse replacement. Dismissal meant ruin. It meant being turned out without a name or a letter, no standing to seek another manor, no coin to buy passage to town, no protection on the open road. And she was no longer young Dot, so when the steward turned and asked, "Do you wish to speak?" In your defense, she did something rare. She looked him in the eye and said, "I do." She led them without permission into the hall where the children sat eating. Not feasting, just eating. A weak broth, a wedge of hard bread, a bit of dried turnip. She let him see their bones, their dull eyes, the boy whose legs were thinner than broomsticks. She pointed to the workmen dragging themselves from field to table, the shepherd who hadn't eaten meat since March. The washerwoman who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite, but still rose to clean linens with one hand. And then she led him to the storeroom. Empty shelves, 1 onion, a scoop of flour, half a sack of oats. She said nothing, just watched. The steward said little, but the scribe paused more often now, scribbled, thought. Finally, after a long silence, the steward nodded. You fed them too well. But you fed them, and that, in a manner where many cooks let hunger thin the ranks, was rare. She was fined, a silver groat. Enough to sting, not ruin. But she kept her position, and the spring brought rainily persistent. Welcome, the fields soaked it in like a dry mouth at last quenched. Seeds were planted, weeds burned back, ploughs dragged once more through the dark. Awakening soil in the kitchen, she began again. Nettles first gathered from the hedgerow, boiled for greens, then early leeks, and finally the smallest of the spring. Peas. She smiled when the hens laid eggs, wept a little when the first batch of cheese cured properly by summer. The pot was full again, and yet the memory of winter never left. It lingered like smoke in the thatch, in the cracks between stones, in the way she set aside just a little of each good day, a pinch of salt, an extra crust, a strip of dried thyme hidden behind a loose brick near the hearth. For next time, because there was always a next time, and she had learned that the pot, like the people it fed, must always be ready to stretch, to give, to survive. Not just to boil, but to endure, and maybe, just maybe, to hold one more ladle than you think it can. You might think that life in a monastery was all chance and silence, pages of parchment and flickering candlelight, and you'd be right mostly. But there was another rhythm there too, a quieter one, perhaps, but no less constant. It came not from the chapel, but from the kitchen, a world of low ceilings, soot-darkened beams, and slow fires that rarely went out. Every day in the monastery, someone had to feed the brethren, and that someone, more often than not, was Brother Ulrich. He wasn't particularly pious, not in the way the abbot was, nor in the long-winded style of Brother Hugo, who quoted Latin even in his sleep. Ulrich's faith was different, less about the psalms, more about provision. He believed in turning barley into porridge, in making turnips palatable, and in keeping 50 monks upright and regular through the long Lenten fast. He believed, in short, in the sanctity of stew. His kitchen lay in a low building just off the cloister walk, near enough to the refectory for ease, far enough from the dormitories to keep the smells good or bad away from the brothers' slumber. It had no chimney, only a vent in the thatched roof, and even that smoked and spat on cold days. The air inside was always thick, with steam, with ash, and with the gentle perfume of onions, garlic, and wet wool. Ulrich rose well before the bell. For prime, he lit the fire before his eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. Not with flint, he didn't trust it, but from the embers he banked each night, buried under ash so they'd keep warm. Then he fetched water, not from the well like others, but from the stream beyond the orchard. Colder there, cleaner, better. For boiling by the time the first bell sounded, the fire was alive. The kettle hanging heavy with oats or beans, and the bread dough rising slowly near the oven's edge. There were no eggs meat, and animal products were restricted most days, but a few times a year. On feast days, the rules relaxed. Those were special mornings, days when Brother Ulrich would sneak in butter from the guest house pantry, or cheese from the cellarium, and work it into the loaves, while no one watched. Not out of greed, but mercy. Even monks deserved softness now and then. You see, the rule of Saint Benedict governed everything. And the rule was strict. Meals were to be taken twice daily, once around midday, and once in the evening except during Lent, when one meal sufficed. No meat from four-legged animals, no talking during meals, only scripture read aloud. No gluttony, no second helpings unless the abbot declared it. And yet, within those rules, was a quiet art to feeding so many mouths with so little. Ulrich became a master of the monastery's calendar. He knew which days were fasts, which allowed fish, and which feasts demanded better. He learned to stretch split peas into satisfying pottage, to thicken soups with crusts, to coax depth from cabbages and lentils, and most of all, he knew how to time everything. The bells governed monastic life, matones, lauds, prime terce, sext none, vespers. Still, despite the dangers, some cooks found clever ways to survive. They used their proximity to power to listen, quietly, carefully. The kitchens overheard things, conversations during meals, late-night gossip from drunken nobles, whispers among the pages, secrets spilled like broth on a hot floor. It wasn't uncommon for a clever cook to trade a piece of overheard gossip for leniency, or for a steward to bribe a cook to learn which guests were eating where. In one manor record, from the late 1200s, there's a curious note about a kitchen boy removed from duty for talking beyond his place. Historians believe this may have referred to eavesdropping, so the kitchen, while brutal, became a place where information flowed as freely as gravy, where those at the bottom sometimes knew more than those above them. A sort of smoky, firelit court of its own, and yet, for all this danger, monotony remained the norm. The daily rhythm didn't change. Rise with the dark, boil water, grind grain, stir pottage, salt fish, turn, spit, scrub trenches, sleep in straw. Repeat. Even the layout of the palace kitchen was designed to keep everyone in motion. Narrow aisles, low beams, hot stones. You had to move quickly, and carefully, knowing that a broken jug of honey or spilled sack of flour could mean an entire day of extra labor, or a docking of your already meager pay. Cooks worked under enormous pressure, but with little voice. They were as essential as they were invisible, like the wooden beams that held up the roof, or the ash that kept the hearth burning. And still, the job had its moments. On feast days, when the tables groaned under the weight of venison and eel pies and sculpted sugar castles, the cooks would sometimes step back just for a moment to watch. They wouldn't eat, of course not the good stuff, but they might sneak a heel of bread, a spoon of stew, a bit of candied fruit if no one was watching, and maybe, for a few seconds, they'd feel proud that they had made this possible, that their labor unseen, exhausting, and greasy, been the quiet engine behind the kingdom's splendor. But pride didn't last long. Not in the kitchen. Not when the plates came back dirty, the fires burned low, and the pots had to be scrubbed for the morning meal. Still, in the shadows of the grandest halls, behind the laughter of nobles and the clang of goblets, the kitchen endured. Its people endured. But what became of those who stayed too long, who never rose beyond scullery work, whose backs gave out before they ever tasted a fine meal? Well, that's something worth exploring. By now, you felt the heat, the scrape of iron pots, the shuffle of straw underfoot, the dull ache of lifting, turning, hauling, and serving. You've seen the cook's world from the inside. Monotony, its quiet danger, its strange mix of invisibility and importance. But we haven't yet answered what happened to those who stayed. What became of the medieval cook who served for years? Or the spit boy who never left the hearth? Let's begin, again, in the shadows. The lowest rung in the kitchen, a turnspit. Boy or scullion had a grim path ahead. If he were lucky, he'd move up. If not, his life would stay locked to the rhythm of wood smoke and boiling broth. The average kitchen servant worked 16 hours a day, especially in a noble household. Days off were rare, even on religious holidays, because feasting was work, not rest. But once a turnspit grew older, he might be shifted. Maybe to help with bread. Maybe to the cold room if there was one. Or to grind spices with a mortar nearly as heavy as his arms. Promotion wasn't about skill, but necessity. You moved up only when someone died, or when your body gave out at one task and you were still useful at another. Few wrote about them. Even fewer remembered their names. But the palace records survive. You'll find entries like William of the kitchen injured his leg in the smokehouse. Thomas removed from spit turning, assigned to grain measure. Agnes dismissed for breaking crockery, to pence docked, and sometimes more chilling entries. Cook John gone missing, suspected taken to the stocks. Marjorie sickened from spoiled fowl, sent to infirmary, did not return. The kitchen didn't kill you outright. It just wore you down, piece by piece. Slowly, quietly. There was no pension, no retirement. If you were fortunate and served well, you might be given a small cottage in the outer yard. Maybe even a stipend of food grain, salted meat, dried peas. A thank you, not from the Lord, but from the steward who appreciated your silence and your ability to work through illness. Some did rise, a rare few made it to the position of master cooker, respected title in the great houses. These cooks had status, a measure of independence and influence. They oversaw menus, supervised budgets, and occasionally even advised on guest arrangements. Some could read. A few even signed their names in neat Latin letters on kitchen ledgers. But that was the exception, not the rule, more commonly. A cook might become what was called a free man of the ladle, a senior servant still bound to the household, but given a small voice in decisions. He might have his own apron, a set of knives, and even a boy to train. But it was still a job of servitude. You served food until your hands gave out, or your back bent permanently, and then you were done. Some turned to begging. Some to peddling small goods made from kitchen scraps, bones, herbs, even hardened bread crusts to feed pigs. Others simply disappeared from records, their final days unmarked, their lives reduced to a smudge of grease on the margin of a parchment roll. But there's something more, something we shouldn't miss. These cooks were the living memory of taste. In a world before written recipes were widespread, before printed books of cookery filled noble libraries, the medieval cook was a keeper of flavors. He, and often she, remembered the correct thickness of the barley gruel, the proper layering of a meat pie, the amount of time a goose needed on the fire, not by clock, but by the color of the skin and the crackle of the dripping fat. When one of them died, a recipe might die with them. Imagine that, a dish tasted by kings, lost forever because the one person who could reproduce it slipped from memory. In a sense, these cooks weren't just servants, they were archivists of the table, whispering knowledge from mouth to hand, generation after generation, mostly undocumented and unthanked. There's a kind of dignity in that, isn't there? The world of the kitchen was rarely glorious. but it was deeply human, fragile, resilient. A small, hidden theatre where the great dramas of the realm politics, power, poison played out between bags of flour and boiling kettles. And in that world, the fire never truly slept, even when the palace was quiet. Even when the halls were still and the torches snuffed for the night, someone had to stay behind, to stoke the embers, to watch the coals, to ensure that in the grey, pre-dawn hours, when the next day's bread would begin to rise and the meat would return to the spit, the kitchen was ready. So picture, if you will, one of those nameless cooks, older now, stooped, soot-marked hands, tough from years of labour. He sits by the hearth as the fire flickers low, not quite asleep, not quite awake. His life has been heat and hunger and hard-earned knowledge, and maybe he feels, for a brief second, like he mattered, because without him, the feast never starts. Without him, the palace would be cold. Without him, history would never have tasted the same. The morning comes quietly in a feudal manner. There are no grand tapestries here, no gold platters or jeweled goblets, just damp walls, low ceilings, and the smell of earth soaked with last night's rain. The manor cook wakes not with an alarm, but with the sound of footsteps, farmhands moving across the yard, a door creaking open, a pig grunting as it's led to the far side of the fields. For this cook, the day begins well before light, and not with a recipe, but with a bucket. Because often it was a woman in these smaller kitchens fills the bucket with water drawn from the well, careful not to spill too much. Water is heavy, and her back already aches from yesterday. The hearth is cold, the coals buried in ash from the night before. She kneels, pokes through the pile, finds a few faint embers, and blows gently. It takes time. The fire doesn't always want to come back, but it must, because breakfast, as simple as it is, won't wait. The manor's labourers need food before they go to the fields. Not much, just enough to keep them upright through the ploughing, the muck, the long hours of bent backs and heavy hands. And that food almost always comes from the same old pottage, a slow simmered stew of whatever could be spared. Barley, oats, beans, sometimes onions or leeks. A strip of bacon if someone's been lucky, but most days there's no meat. Just pulses and roots thickened with old bread, boiled until everything softens into something vaguely warm and vaguely edible. The pot never really empties. It sits in the corner of the hearth, simmering endlessly. Leftovers become tomorrow's base. A splash of water, another handful of lentils, a few greens pulled from the edges of the garden. Stir, taste, stir again. This is not cuisine, it is sustenance, and if it's too thin, the cook hears about it, not from the Lord. He rarely steps foot in the kitchens of the lower manor, but from the steward, the bailiff, the men who manage labour, grain storage, and the tiny but dwindling ledger that tells how much barley is left until the next harvest, because that's the real fear. Not famine, not yet, but shortage. A medieval manor lived and died by its harvest. Cycle. In years of abundance, there might be salted pork, maybe some cheese, even ale to spare. But in lean years, the cook is expected to stretch everything, to make watery oats taste like a meal, to make 2 onions last a week, to invent variety out of sameness. And when she fails, it's not just hunger people feel, it's resentment. The peasants don't always understand that she's given nothing more than a few sacks of grain and a block of salt. They just know. Their stomachs ache, that the broth is thin, that yesterday's portion was better than today's. Grumbling grows. The kitchen is blamed, so she learns to be clever. She roasts garlic to make the broth richer. She hides crushed turnip in porridge to make it look more plentiful. She soaks dried beans to make them softer, more filling. And when she has nothing at all, she adds ashes from the fire knot for taste. But to mimic the dark flecks of meat or spice, there's no deception in it, not really. Just survival, because the manor cook is not just feeding the laborers, she's keeping the whole rhythm of the estate in motion. A poorly fed peasant works slower. A sick field hand means less barley. Less barley means tighter rations. Tighter rations mean more unrest. And more unrest, well, that leads to punishment. The punishments were never hers to give, but she heard them. Whippings in the yard, fines for taking extra bread, a boy put in the stocks for sneaking leeks from the storeroom, and once a man beaten for stealing dried peas, just a handful. He had children. She remembered that. She'd seen him standing outside the door, staring at her pot, silent. She gave him nothing. She couldn't. The grain was counted daily, not just in bushels, but in scoops. Every portion documented. Every spilled cup questioned. Once, when a bag of oats was found ripped, she was brought in and asked if it was her knife that had done it. It wasn't, but she apologized anyway, because an apology was safer than defiance, and safer still than the truth that mice, rain, or simple where had likely opened the bag. In this world, someone was always to blame, and the cook, being closest to the food, was rarely far from suspicion. Yet for all this, she stayed, because the job, hard as it was, offered something rare in the feudal system. A bit of stability. She had a place to sleep. Warmth of a sort. Access to food, however meager, and a role one that, if done well, could earn her a kind of quiet respect among the manor folk. Some mornings, the workers would nod as they took their bowls. A child might say thank you. An old man might offer her an apple he'd hidden from his own share. These moments weren't common, but when they came, they reminded her that her labor, her simmering pot mattered still. The pressure never lifted. Every week brought new worry. Would the next delivery of barley arrive? Would the salted fish still be edible? Would the chickens start laying again? And if not, could she stretch the gruel further? Could she avoid another scolding from the steward, another disappointed stare from the steward's wife? Sometimes she found herself talking to the pot, not out of madness, but habit, stirring, murmuring, imagining the pottage answering back with a burble, a sigh that it never did, of course. But the fire crackled softly, the steam rose gently, and the smell, however plain, felt like something close to comfort. And perhaps that's what kept her going. Not the rations, not the thanks, but the sense that something was always cooking, even in the worst of times. That even when the manor grew quiet with hunger and fear, her pot still bubbled. A small promise, barely flavored, barely full, but there, always there. But what happens when the pot runs dry? When a bad harvest turns into a winter without stores? When scarcity shifts into starvation, and the manor looks to its cook, not for meals but for answers? There was a phrase whispered round the hearth as autumn ended, and the skies turned hard with winter grey. The hunger season is here. Not spoken loudly, never in front of the steward or the priest, but among the labourers, the children. The kitchen hands sit past quietly like a chill draught under the door. It referred to that long stretch between the end of the autumn harvest and the beginning of spring planting, when no more grain would come from the fields, no more greens from the garden, and the cellars once noisy with sacks and barrels grew silent. The manor cook, more than anyone, felt it creeping. Her stores grew lean. What remained was counted, weighed, scraped. Each day she ran her fingers through the sacks of oats. Not to measure them, she already knew how low they were, just to feel how much was left. She started locking the pantry door, not because she didn't trust the servants, but because everyone was hungry, and even the honest could be tempted. The salted meat, already scarce, grew rancid if not watched closely. The fish barrels leaked brine. Rats chewed through one of the onion braids. Everything was rotting or vanishing or just never enough. There were tricks, of course. She soaked stale bread in warm water and mashed it with dried peas, made it look like porridge. She used ale gone sour to flavor broth. She dried cabbage leaves near the hearth and ground them into powder to fake the taste of herbs. But even tricks have limits. The laborers worked through frost and mud. Their strength waned. She heard it in the way they shuffled, saw it in their sunken cheeks, their stiff joints. Fewer came to the mess hall early. Some didn't come at all, choosing instead to save their strength for work or lie still in the barns. The steward issued decrees, half portions for those not working the fields, bread only for the ox drivers and ploughmen, no ale for the old or infirm. She obeyed, but she hated it. She watched the old widow breeder take her small bowl and shuffle back to the corner, sitting in silence as the children were fed first. Watched a boy named Toma press his finger along the edge of his trencher to lick every last bit of broth. Watched her own apprentice, a pale girl with a bad foot, weep quietly when told there would be no seconds. It was a hard winter, worse than the ones before. Rumors of poor harvests in neighboring villages, tales of theft on the roads, even talk of wolves coming closer to the edge of the fields. And always the same quiet fear, would the grain hold out? The manor lord rarely appeared. He dined in the hall with his family and the chaplain, eating food brought from the upper kitchen, different from the main kitchen where the workers' meals were made. She didn't cook there. She wasn't noble enough or clean enough. That task fell to another, better paid, better dressed. But she knew what they ate. Goose, roasted nuts, spiced pears, white bread from fine milled flour. She smelled it through the cracks in the doors, and on Sundays, as part of tradition, scraps from the Lord's table were passed down to the lower kitchen. Bone ends, old apples, skins, crusts, some of it still warm, most of it barely edible. Still, she gathered it. She set aside the bones to flavor broth. She peeled the spoiled sides from the apples. Even a hardened heel of bread, soaked in water, could feed a child. Her knife grew dull from scraping so often at the edges of rot. The worst moment came one evening when a small child, barely 5, collapsed in the doorway. The laborers said the boy hadn't eaten in 2 days. His mother was sick. His father had been sent to repair a collapsed bridge and hadn't returned. No one had noticed how quiet the hut had become. The cook fed him broth, the richest she could make that day, held him by the hearth, let him sleep by the embers. He recovered slowly. But the image haunted her, the way his hands had trembled around the spoon, the way his lips barely moved. Some grumbled, most nodded. They understood. This was the ritual. This was the end. The Baron's final feast was laid out on a long table in the great hall. The hall, like everything else, looked tired. Banners sagged in damp air. Wax from the last banquet still crusted the floor. The goblets had lost their shine. But the food, such as it was, gleamed. The pigeon was brown and crackled. The bread glistened with oil. The soup steamed. The wine glowed red, warm from the hearth. And the air, for just a moment, smelled like it used to, like meat, like fire, like promise. The Baron entered slowly. His face was sallow, eyes sunken. But his beard had been combed. He wore his heavy cloak of state, not because it was warm, but because it still meant something. He sat without ceremony, and for the next half hour, he and his remaining household ate in silence. No music, no speech, just chewing, swallowing, breathing. Emmerich stood to the side, watching. He didn't taste anything himself. There wouldn't be seconds when it was over. The Baron lifted his goblet just. A finger's depth of wine left. To the cook, he said softly, and drank. That night, Emmerich returned to the kitchen. He sat by the hearth, empty pots stacked around him like soldiers after battle. He reached into his apron and pulled out a single clove. He sniffed it, then tucked it away again. You never knew what tomorrow might need. The siege would end one way, or another. The gates would open, maybe to peace, maybe not. But he knew one thing. Someone would need to feed the survivors, and perhaps, just perhaps, there would be enough flour left to make a real loaf of bread. Meals were announced by the tolling of a small bell. Not loud, not urgent, just a gentle signal that it was time again. The food varied with the season, but the cycle had a rhythm. In spring, new greens, sprouted peas, and the first tender shoots. Of sorrel and nettles, sometimes made into broth, sometimes stewed with onions. In summer, berries and herbs, thick leeks, the occasional egg when the hens were generous. Autumn, barley bread, apples in baskets, and cabbages boiled until soft. And winter, dried beans, salt fish, thin porridge, and prayers. Fat was rare, but not unknown. On feast days, Ulrich used a few spoonfuls saved from rendering to grease the pan for small oat cakes. The smell of fat in a hot pan just for a moment would travel through the cloister like a whisper of indulgence. But the focus was always simplicity. Meat was never served, except to the sick, and even then only sparingly. This wasn't just religious dogma, it was also practicality. Raising and butchering animals was costly, time-consuming, and risky. One bad winter, one outbreak of hoof rot, and a whole season's meat could vanish. So, the kitchen adapted when one of the few pigs was slaughtered in November. Ulrich oversaw the entire process. The fat was rendered and saved. The organs, liver, kidney, heart were cooked the same day. The head was boiled, the skin turned to stock. Nothing was wasted. The best pieces, the hams and shoulders, were salted with coarse, precious crystals, hauled from a distant salt works and carefully guarded in the cellar. Ulrich would rub them down daily at first, then hang them above the hearth, letting the smoke slowly cure the meat over many weeks. Each ham was marked with a symbol, one for the season, one for the intended use. Most were for visitors or special occasions. One, sometimes two, was saved for Christmas. Every ham had a purpose. Just like every monk, Ulrich had seen so many novices come and go. Some transferred to other houses. Some struggled with the silence. Some took up other trades, cellars, infirmarians. But a few stayed with him in the kitchen. He taught them everything he knew. How to make broth with one onion and patience. How to dry herbs in the loft above the oven. How to stack wood so it burned evenly and with less smoke. But most of all, He taught them to respect the food, not to revere it, not to crave it, but to honor it. A single bowl of porridge, made carefully, served humbly, and eaten in silence, was not just sustenance. It was part of the life they had chosen, a rhythm, a prayer, even when they had more than enough after. A good harvest or a wealthy visitor's gift or rick never let waste creep in. Leftovers were reused, crusts fed to the birds, vegetable peelings composted for the garden. He lived by one unspoken rule, that the discipline of the kitchen should reflect the discipline of the soul. But time, like flame, burns all things eventually. One winter evening, after vespers, Ulrich sat on the low stool by the hearth longer than usual. The broth was simmering. The barley had already been stirred. The others had gone to their cells. He watched the firelight flicker against the blackened stones, thought about the years, the thousands of meals, the monks he'd known, the faces that had changed, the recipes that never did. He touched a handle of his ladle worn smooth by decades of use, and he wondered what would remain. Would someone remember the way he salted lentils just a touch more in winter? The timing of when to cover the cauldron, to keep the steam in. The rhythm of stirring clockwise, then widdershins, then clockwise again. He doubted it, but that didn't matter. Because in a monastery, things were not done for legacy. They were done for the doing. The same way the bells tolled. The same way prayers were whispered. The same way bread was kneaded every morning in the cold, with stiff fingers and a bowed head. Monastic life was not about achievement. It was about continuity, and the kitchen, with its soot-black beams and chipped bowls, had always been part of that. The next day, Ulrich rose early, as always, kindled the fire, measured the grain, stirred the oats. The day passed like every other bell. Prayers, meals, quiet. Years later, when he was gone, the new kitchen master brother, Cedric, now greyer and calmer still, used Ulrich's ladle. Still made broth the old way, still salted the lentils just so, and on cold days, when the hearth burned low and the barley stew simmered slowly in the corner, some said they could almost hear him still his soft footsteps, the rattle of bowls, and the steady scrape of a wooden spoon against iron. A kind of prayer, a kind of memory, a kind of history, preserved not in books or stories, but in fire and fat and silence. The wind howled through the battlements like an animal in pain. Somewhere, beyond the outer wall, a crow cawed in the distance, likely picking at something unfortunate left behind from a skirmish. You could smell the tension. Not just the tension of war, but the kind that builds inside cold kitchens and stores half full of dwindling flour sacks. Inside the stone belly of the keep, the hearth fire flickered uncertainly. It was early morning, and despite the long shadows cast across the great hall, it was already hot. Not from the fire, but from the sheer exhaustion of it all being weeks into a siege, with no relief in sight. This wasn't how a cook was supposed to live. Castle kitchens were built for grandeur spits, large enough to roast boar. Ovens, too. Bake dozens of loaves. Stone tables, scrubbed clean after long feasts of venison, trout, stewed pears, and crusty bread. A cook in a noble household had a place of pride. He knew the hunger of a knight returning from a hunt. He understood the importance of spice and timing and smoke, but none of that mattered when the food ran out. It had started slow. A week into the siege, the salt barrels had to be rationed. By the second week, the flour was moved to a locked storeroom. By the third, the ale started tasting more like water, and by the fourth, the pigeons in the tower began to disappear. Lord's cook, a man named Emmerich, had served 3 barons and outlived 2. He was not easily rattled, but even he had never cooked under these conditions. The potatoes, what few were left, had gone soft. The cabbage stored in the cellar was shriveling. Carrots were gone. Meat was rare and now mostly salted or dried so hard it had to be soaked for hours in boiling water just to chew. They called him Cook Emmerich, though he hadn't done much actual cooking of late. It was more like managing decline. Still, the kitchens had to operate. The garrison needed food. The squires needed food. The nobles most of all expected something hot at least once a day. So Emmerich worked. He started each morning with a grim survey. The storage bins were nearly empty. A handful of onions, a fistful of oats, 1 goose egg, 2 smoked fish. The apple barrel held 3 soft ones, already turning. He used everything. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled into thin stock. Breadcrumbs were mashed into pastes and fried in oil. The stale wine sour now was poured into weak stews. Even the mold on the cheese was scraped off, and the rest chopped into meals, as though it had never gone bad. But that day on that bitter morning, as wind crept down through the chimney like a thief, something changed. The lord of the castle had decided to throw a banquet. A feast, not a real one, of course. Not like in peacetime, but a symbolic one. For morale, he had said. For loyalty. Emmerich was summoned that very morning. His boots scuffed the worn stone steps as he walked up to the solar, where the baron stood hunched near a window slit, watching for movement beyond the tree line. "We need a feast," the baron said without turning. "Make it feel real. A banquet, bread, smoke, fat on the air. Get them to believe we are thriving, even if we are not." Emmerich said nothing. He bowed. He turned. He descended. There were no boars in the larder, no haunches, no wine worth serving. And yet he was expected to craft the illusion of plenty, and so he got to work. He began by lighting every oven, even the ones unused for days. The heat would rise through the stone floors, spreading warmth. He instructed the boys to burn rosemary and garlic skins on the edge of the fire. It would smell like something rich. He sent word to the women in the still room to boil apples, with cinnamon bark from the spice box, releasing the sweet scent down the hallway. Illusion, aroma as deception. He roasted bones with herbs to create smoke, and the faint smell of meat. He soaked stale bread in oil, pressed it into molds, and fried it until golden, serving it with salted butter as if it were some new creation. He basted root vegetables in rendered fat from an old pot left over from last year's pig slaughter, what little was left. He created porridge with dried berries on top, arranged just so to resemble something celebratory. He plated stews in wide, shallow bowls so they'd seem fuller. The meats were scarce: some rabbit, some pigeon, 1 old joint of lamb. So he shredded them into small pieces, buried them in broth, and stretched each serving with chopped herbs. He sent servers to walk through the halls, carrying trays, empty ones, but beneath cloth covers. It gave the illusion that more was coming. It wasn't. That night, the hall was lit with torches. The fire glowed. The smell of food cooked or not filled the air. Men joked, if nervously. They drank weak ale. They dipped crusts in broth. They pretended they weren't hungry, because that was the point. Pretend. Even the baron played along. He stood tall, gave a toast, claimed the enemy outside had no idea what bounty lay within. Laughter followed, though hollow. Soldiers clapped. Emmerich sat on a bench in the corner, quietly sipping broth, watching, listening. He had survived this long not because he was the best cook, but because he knew how to stretch, how to improvise, how to make a meal out of less than nothing. But as he stirred the last pot for the night, scraping the bottom clean with a wooden spoon, he had to wonder, how long could the illusion hold? How many more feasts could be faked? And what would happen when even the bones were gone? The castle slept lightly that night. Not just the men on the walls or the squires curled up in straw-lined corners, but even the mice beneath the pantry stones. Hunger wakes everything, and in a castle under siege, sleep is a fragile thing. It can be broken by the wind, by a distant horn, or by the growl of one's own stomach. Emmerich, the castle cook, hadn't slept properly in days. His dreams had started to echo the kitchen clanging lids, bubbling pots, and the sharp snap of dry firewood. But most of all, it was the quiet and eerie, creeping quiet that had started to feel louder than the feast had been. That banquet, if one could even call it, that had done what it needed to do. Spirits had lifted, men had joked, even the Baron had smiled with his cracked lips and pale cheeks. But Emmerich had watched them all, carefully, and he knew the truth. It had only worked because they believed there would be another. The next morning brought no surprises, only fewer supplies. A mouse had gotten into the barley bin, leaving droppings and chewed corners. The smokehouse held only 2 sides of pork, more bone than meat. One was already going rancid. The salted fish were too salty to eat unless boiled. And even the vinegar, usually so reliable, had turned cloudy. And then there was the bread. Once the pride of the kitchen, the loaves that filled the hall with that warm, earthly smell of home. Now it had become an experiment in compromise. The good flour was long gone. Emmerich had tried mixing in dried peas, then barley, then even bits of ground acorn. It baked well enough, but the taste lingered on the tongue like ash, and it turned to stone within hours. Bread made from desperation didn't just feed the body, betrayed it that day. The kitchen girls tried to bake for small loaves, 2 burned, 1 cracked. The last crumbled into dry chunks the moment it was sliced. He picked one up and tapped it gently against the wooden counter. The sound was more like a knock than a tap. Emmerich shook his head. "You could kill a man with this," he muttered. Still, it was food. And in wartime, even failed bread was treasure. Outside, the siege continued. No new attacks, just silence. Worse, perhaps. The kind of silence that meant the enemy was either planning or waiting. Emmerich sent the kitchen boys to collect herbs. From the small garden tucked behind the stables, it had once grown rosemary, thyme, and mint. Now, only a few sad stalks of garlic and a patch of sage remained. The mint had withered in the cold. The rosemary had been burned weeks ago for its scent during the Baron's mock feast. One of the boys, small, nervous, with hair always in his eyes, returned with a limp sprig of parsley and 2 snails. Emmerich didn't even blink. He plucked the snails from the boy's hand, dropped them in a jar of water, and added a pinch of flour. By morning, the snails would purge their stomachs, and by midday they would be stew. The boy looked horrified. Emmerich offered no comfort. "We cook what we have." He said it simply, not cruelly, because there was no time for illusions anymore. That afternoon, the kitchen was hotter than usual. The ovens, once used to churn out pies and pastries, now served one purpose: heat. He filled one with firewood not for baking, but for boiling stones, yes. Stones they had begun this strange ritual a week prior. A borrowed idea, he thought, perhaps from some Roman story, or a peasant tale passed from grandmother to daughter. The idea was simple. If you had nothing, you still boiled something. So Emmerich boiled stones. He picked smooth, round ones from the edge of the wall, washed them thoroughly, and placed them in a great iron cauldron with water, herbs, and just a splash of vinegar. It smelled like soup. It even looked like soup. And sometimes, he whispered to himself, if you stirred it long enough, your stomach believed it was soup. He served it to the stable boys and the older squires. The soldiers got stew, if you could call it that. Mostly water thickened with oat scrapings and old cabbage leaves. But the Baron and his inner circle, they got something different. Emmerich had learned long ago that a cook was not just a servant. He was a politician of survival. He had to please those in power, to protect those below. So he saved the good bit slivers of cheese, the last of the honey, a small pouch of saffron buried deep in the spice chest for the nobles. He used them sparingly, a pinch here, a trickle there, enough to make the Baron feel secure, important, respected, fed, because, as long as the Baron believed he was in control, the kitchen could keep operating. And if the kitchen worked, so did the castle. But Emmerich knew it couldn't last one night. After the hall had gone dark and the hearth had burned down to coals, he sat alone by the window slit, a chunk of burned bread in his hand. He gnawed on it slowly, staring at the moonlight on the stones. He remembered the last time he had seen bread rise in the oven properly rise, with golden crust and steam inside. That had been months ago, before the siege, before the world outside the walls had vanished into enemy tents and watch fires, and he wondered, would bread ever rise again? Would the stones ever stop boiling? Would the kitchens ever smell of real meat, real herbs, and warm honeyed cream? He closed his eyes and listened. No wind, no wind. Horns just the soft hiss of cooling pots. The morning sky above the castle was the color of old putterdam, heavy and reluctant. The kind of sky that made you feel like the day might never quite start in. The kitchen, the hearthstones were cold. That alone was a warning. Emmerich usually kept the coals alive through the night, tucked under ash, glowing faintly like tired fireflies. But last night had been different. The last of the firewood had gone to boiling water for the wounded. There'd been a skirmish at the outer gate. Just a test, really. The enemy pressing a little, tugging at the edges. But it was enough to snap a man's leg, open a soldier's cheek, and drain the last warm broth from the cook's stores. So now, Emmerich stood before a cold hearth, rubbing his hands together. His fingers were smudged with flour and soot and the red bite of salt. His apron hung limp, stiff with weeks of grease, and somewhere above, a pigeon cooed. He looked up at the rafters. It wasn't the pigeon that interested him. It was the droppings. Pigeon droppings meant pigeons, and pigeons meant protein. He called for the kitchen boy, the same one who'd brought him snail's end, handed him a net and a long pole. Be clever, quick. The boy didn't need to be told. Twice, meanwhile, Emmerich began to measure out the last of everything. A few onions with mouldy skins, one wrinkled turnip, the broken end of a cheese wheel that smelled like wet boots, and a dried beef tendon that had hardened into something between jerky and leather. From this, he would make soup, or something like it. By midday, the castle had grown loud again. A false alarmer scout thought he saw smoke beyond the tree line, but it was only mist curling off the grass. Still, it sent half the guards scrambling. They were exhausted, half mad with vigilance. The tension was harder than any blade. It wore down the mind faster than it did the body. And the kitchen had started to feel the same. Even the rats had grown braver. One scurried across the pantry shelf in broad daylight, pausing to sniff a lump of dried lard before darting into a gap behind the wall. Emmerich watched it go. He didn't even flinch anymore. If he could have caught it, cleaned it, and skinned it properly, he would have added it to the pot without guilt. In fact, he was planning to. But then the bell rang. Not the chapel bell, not the warning bell, the little handbell, the one they used only for requests from the Lord's solar Emmerich. Stomach sank. He walked upstairs, wiping his hands on his apron. The corridor smelled of damp cloth and chamber pots. A page stood outside the solar, pale and tight-lipped. The Baron requests a final feast. The boy said, his voice barely a whisper. Emmerich blinked. Final. The page hesitated, then nodded. He says we open the gates tomorrow. To parley or surrender. Emmerich didn't respond right away. He simply looked past the boy at the thick wooden door and imagined what sat behind it. The Baron thinner now, greyer. Barely the shape he'd been when the siege began, still clinging to ceremony. A final feast. He almost laughed, but he didn't. Instead, he went back to the kitchen and got to work. He used everything, all the things. He'd been saving the bitter preserved duck in fat, the dried cherries, the clove-stuck apples forgotten in the spice chest. He even used the last of the wine, sour though it was. He mixed it with water, honey, and herbs to make a kind of weak mulled cordial. He boiled bones into broth, then strained it through cloth to catch the grit. He kneaded the last of the flour with rendered fat, not water, to make a dense, rich flatbread. It would fry instead of bake. He had no wood left for the oven, but it would at least be warm, golden, and fragrant. The pigeon boy returned with 2 birds. One was dead already, snapped neck, clean. The other flapped wildly in the bag until Emmerich ended its panic with a single twist. He plucked, cleaned, and stuffed them with a mixture of onion, old herbs, and wild sorrel. Then he skewered them on an iron spit and roasted them above a shallow pit filled with coals stolen from the blacksmith's forge. The smell of pigeon, fat and smoke and charred skin drew men to the kitchen door. He turned them all away. I'm cooking for the Baron. Ulrich didn't need to hear them anymore. His day unfolded like clockwork without the chimes. He knew exactly how long it took to simmer barley until soft, how many misereres it took to roast an onion. He could gut a fish by feel, slice a leek. In rhythm with a Gregorian chant, stir a pot with one hand and open a sack of rye with the other. But the kitchen was not without trials. There were days when the cellar was damp and flour turned to paste. Days when the rains swelled the stream and the water was too murky to boil. Days when the monks fell ill from spoiled beans and Ulrich took the blame quietly. And there were temptations. Oh yes, even here. Once he found a wheel of aged cheese hidden behind the herbs in the pantry, unmarked, unrecorded, left, perhaps, by a visiting monk or forgotten by the cellarer. He turned it in, but not before he sliced off a single wedge. Just a taste. It had been months since he'd had anything rich, he confessed. Was forgiven, but he never forgot the salt of it. Then there was Brother Edmar, the assistant cook, for 2 seasons. Young, always hungry, and careless with the fasts. He once snuck out to the village and returned with a pheasant. Ulrich refused to cook it. Edmar roasted it in secret, in the small hearth behind the woodpile. The scent gave him away. The punishment was swift. a week of silence, and cold meals alone in the cloister. But Edmar stayed, and, in time, he learned. Everyone did, because the kitchen, like the chapel, was a place of formation. A place where obedience was tested, not just by prayer, but by patience. Stirring slowly, cleaning often, feeding others before feeding oneself. There was peace in it, even joy. Ulrich found it in small things. The way the dough felt when it was ready. The shine on a ladle cleaned to perfection. The sound of 50 spoons scraping bowls in perfect silence during supper. He rarely ate with the others. He preferred a crust by the hearth, with steam on his face and the soft huff of the oven nearby. Sometimes he sang to himself, just a line or two of chant, soft, like smoke curling into air. He wasn't well known outside the monastery. No cook was. His name wouldn't appear in any chronicle or bishop's register. But every brother who lived through that long, bitter winter of 848, when the snows stayed until April and the granary was nearly bare, remembered how the kitchen still smelled of onions, and how no bowl went empty. And if you asked them why, they would tell you, because Brother Ulrich knew his fire, and he knew his rule, and somehow he always found just enough. There was a particular silence that belonged only to monasteries in winter, not the kind found in empty fields or quiet forests, but a stillness carved out by ritual, a silence punctuated only by the creak of wooden doors, the scrape of sandals on stone, or the low murmur of prayer in the early hours. And in that long stretch of cold, while most of the world outside slowed to survival, the kitchen inside the monastery, Brother Ulrich's world worked harder than ever. It was Lent, and not just any Lent, but a harsh one. The year was 851. The grain stores were lean. The previous summer's barley harvest had been thin, with 2 weeks of hail in June, followed by an infestation of weevils in August. The orchard had fared better, some pears had dried well, but fruit was no substitute for grain. Even the fish pond had partially frozen in January. When the monks pulled back the netting in early February, they found more floaters than swimmers. Brother Ulrich, of course, had known this was coming. He had seen the signs as early as when the last sheaf was threshed, and the steward made a careful note in the account rolls. He'd measured the remaining sacks of rye and peas, counted the smoked fish, watched the butter dwindle, lump by precious lump. He did not panic. Ulrich was not a man who wasted energy on alarm. Instead, he planned. Lent would be strict this year. No meat, naturally. No milk or eggs. Not even fish, except on Sundays and feast days. Bread would be rationed. Thickened soups would stretch further, using whatever roots the garden still offered, mainly leeks, winter onions, and a few tired parsnips that hadn't rotted in the cellar trench. He began preparing the community weeks in advance. He adjusted the morning porridge, less grain, more water, and longer cooking time to make it feel fuller. He salted down the remaining herring carefully, layer by layer, tucking each one into clay pots lined with rough linen. He instructed Brother Edmar to boil bones for stock and reuse the broth twice, even thrice, straining it carefully through linen to hide how thin it had become. The monks felt it, of course. Hunger made tempers short, heads drooped during Sext. There was more coughing in the cloister, and some brothers walked slower between prayers. But no one complained outright. That was not the way here. Instead, they accepted the discipline with bowed heads and chapped hands. Suffering was part of sanctity. Ulrich suffered too, though in his own quiet way. He missed the smell of bread baking with lard, missed the quiet satisfaction of cracking an egg into a bowl and watching the yolk catch the light, missed the feel of flour that hadn't been stretched with ground peas or ground chestnut. It was hard to make food satisfying when every luxury was off limits. And yet, Lent revealed something more. It stripped things down to the essence, to necessity. The food, like the prayers, was plain yet rooted in purpose. A spoonful of barley, stew, slow-cooked and salted just enough, became a comfort in ways a feast never could. It filled, yes, but more importantly, it grounded. Each pot of broth simmering on the fire was a testament to resourcefulness. Each loaf stretched with mashed beans, rather than fat an act of endurance. Each day without complaint an act of quiet faith. And then there were the feast days. Sparse though they were, they marked the Lenten calendar like bright pins on dark cloth. A few times during the long fast, the abbot declared a fish day, salted eel, pickled herring, or if the cellarer was, lucky fresh trout from the monk's own pond, netted at dawn and laid gently in woven baskets, tails still twitching. Ulrich prepared these with reverence. He'd bake them slowly in clay, stuff them with leeks and vinegar, or wrap them in cabbage leaves and lay them in the oven's edge where the heat was softest. These meals were not indulgent, they were reminders that even in abstinence there could be joy, that even discipline could be generous. He taught the novices, too. During Lent, they worked beside him more often, learning how to ration ingredients, measure portions by eye, and make do without the usual. Ulrich rarely raised his voice, but his expectations were exacting. He showed them how to stir without scorching, how to judge heat by the feel of the pot's handle, how to recognize when water had boiled enough, even without a clock or timer. He explained that even the most humble meal could be an offering. He once told Brother Cedric, a particularly clumsy novice, "Scrape the pot well. What sticks is not wasted tomorrow's flavor." Cedric nodded, unsure if it was wisdom or reprimand. And of course, there were accidents. One day, Brother Edmar dropped a sack of dried peas into the hearth. The bag split. Half the peas rolled into the fire. The other half landed in ash and coal dust. Edmar went pale. Ulrich stood silent for a long time, then fetched a sieve and instructed him to separate the usable ones, one by one. It took hours. They ate those peas 2 days later. No one noticed a thing. That was Ulrich's gift-making. It worked no matter what. Quietly, without fuss. The abbot, to his credit, noticed late in the season he came to the kitchen unannounced, watched for a while, tasted the broth, then said simply, "You've done well, brother. You fed the body without burdening the soul." It was high praise. Ulrich said nothing, only nodded and went back to stirring. But that night he allowed himself an extra crust with honey just a smear, scraped from the bottom of the jar. By Easter the mood shifted. The bells seemed lighter. The garden sprouted again. The chickens began laying, slowly. The cellar was not full, but it was no longer bare. There was talk of cheese in summer, of visitors come Whitsun, of honey cakes for the feast of St. Bede. But no one forgot Lent. They remembered the boiled turnips, the silent bowls of pottage, the discipline, and the warmth of the kitchen, where even in the bitter dark there had been food. It wasn't comfort in the usual sense, but it was a kind of grace. Wonderful. Let's return to the cloisters one last time, where the walls are thick, the bells still toll, and the kitchen hearth glows with the same slow, steady warmth it always has. By the time Brother Ulrich was nearing 50 old by any measure in the 9th century, his back ached when he stirred the larger pots. and he had to lean slightly to the left when lifting water from the well. But his hands remained sure, and his sense of taste, honed by decades of repetition and restraint, was as sharp as ever. The kitchen had become his monastery within the monastery. He no longer led prayers, or copied texts in the scriptorium that had passed to younger monks. Ulrich's own pen had dried decades ago, his calligraphy replaced by the slow art of cooking for 30 men who spoke little and asked less. This was not a place of innovation, nor was it meant to be. The monastery was governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, and everything was done with moderation, neither luxurious nor lacking. That extended even to the food. Each monk received 2 meals a day, always in silence, always seated in rows on wooden benches, eating from wooden bowls, drinking from the same clay cups that had been used for decades, some even inherited from older monks now buried beneath the chapel floor.